Hello, hello. Today we're going to be talking about evolutionary thought and scientific thinking. And some key terms that you should know: the scientific method, which is a cycle of scientific practices that help scientists to gain knowledge and spark further scientific inquiries. Basically, it's just the cycle that you go through whenever you are trying to solve a scientific question or answer a scientific question, and the steps that have to be completed for it to actually be scientific. There's also hypothesis, which is a proposed explanation made on the basis of limited evidence as a starting point for further investigation. Basically just an educated prediction of what is going to happen. Starting off with the scientific method, there are multiple ways to do the scientific method. It does not have to be this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 step thing that you follow exactly. It's going to depend on the field that you're in, the actual scientific question you're trying to answer. And it's also going to take different forms depending on how your process goes. So if your results don't actually prove your hypothesis, you might have to go back, construct a new hypothesis, do a new experiment. You also might just take different paths in terms of how you report results, things like that. But to start out, and for this class, we're going to follow this kind of pattern. You're going to observe what is the problem, what's the unknown, what's your general question. Once you have that, then you're going to question it. So you're going to do some research, figure out what you do know. Once you know what you know, you're going to form a hypothesis. So this is your prediction of possible outcomes. Then, of course, you need to test it or experiment. Once you've done that, you want to look at your results and present your collected data. You also need to include any details that can impact the outcomes. So even if it's something minor, you still need to include this, because if somebody is trying to recreate your experiment or to peer review your entire process, they need to know what kind of things can impact just anything involving this process, because it can change the outcome. And you don't want to forget to include something like that and then somebody go to peer review and recreate it and come up with a different outcome that negates yours just because one or two small things were different. Once you have your results, then you're going to form your conclusion or a discussion about the process and how your results answer the hypothesis. So you're essentially going to decide if your hypothesis was correct or not, and again, what impacted the outcome the most. And once you're done with that, of course, you've put in all this work, so you need to share it. That means that you can present it at a conference, at some other kind of official meeting. You can publish it in a journal, you could write it in a lab report, you could write a book, all kinds of different things. But there's really no point in doing this if nobody else can actually learn from your process. So when you're formulating a hypothesis, you need to use conditional statements. These are going to be if-then statements. So if this, then this. There's also something called a null hypothesis, and this is the hypothesis that there is no significant difference between specified populations, and that any observed difference is due to sampling or experimental error. Basically, that the outcome is not statistically significant. In layman's term, this is going to be an argument against your hypothesis. So you're going to form your original hypothesis, then you'll have a null hypothesis that is stating the opposite of your hypothesis. Then you will sometimes have an alternative hypothesis. And these are going to be observations based on a real observed effect, usually the direct opposite of a null hypothesis or an opposing theory, and it's tested when attempting to disprove the null hypothesis. Essentially, this is just going to be your further argument against a null hypothesis. So it's going to be very similar to your original hypothesis, but it's going to be slightly different because the goal is slightly different. When you're experimenting, you're going to have 4 main categories for your variables and your groups in your experiment. You're going to have an independent variable, which is the variable that is changed and controlled in the experiment. So it is the variable that you are influencing. The dependent variable is the variable being tested that reacts to the independent variable. So this is not the variable that you are actually manipulating. You are just seeing how it reacts to the things that you do manipulate. You're also going to have a control group. So this is going to be a group with very minimized variables that's used for comparison, or your baseline group, and an experimental group, which is the group that's actually being administered the testable variable. So if you think about this in terms of like a medical test for a new drug or medicine, your control group is going to be your group that you are not really changing. They're going to be on the same diet, they're going to be on the same activity level, but you're going to give them a placebo pill, so a sugar pill. Your experimental group, you're also going to want to try and keep the variables very similar for the most part, except for the one that you are trying to change, so except for your independent variable. So they're also going to be doing the same diet, they're going to be doing the same activity levels, but you are going to give them the actual medicine. Then when your experiment is done, you can compare that control group with the experimental group to see how the drug actually works and reacts. Moving on to some early scientists. We're going to start with Comte de Buffon. He was a French naturalist. He also believed that Earth was older than biblical predictions. So during Buffon's time, things were very, very religious. Everything was based around the Bible, around the church. They controlled science, they controlled how history was told, pretty much all aspects of thought and daily life. Buffon kind of put a wrench in this. He was not very well liked, actually. He was considered very radical because he believed that Earth was older than biblical predictions. He also believed that animals were created spontaneously and descended or evolved from a single breeding pair, which obviously kind of contradicts that story of Genesis and God's creation of the world. But he actually was not an evolutionist. So rather than believing that animals evolved like we do today, he believed that they had an original perfect form that God still created, and instead that they devolved through time into a less perfect state. This doesn't seem that radical to us, but at the time, everyone still believed that God created everything in his image. It was exactly the way that he created it at the dawn of time, and that nothing changed. So him believing that things could change was considered pretty blasphemous. He also, of course, because of the time, didn't have a lot of ways to scientifically prove these things. But he did pave the way for later theories of evolution and change. One of such was Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. He was actually a French biologist, and he believed that organisms change to the needs of their environments. This is true. Organisms do. Obviously, adaptation occurs. However, the mechanism that he proposed for it was not so true. So he believed in this idea of inheritance of acquired characteristics, that an organism can pass on its physical characteristics that it acquires through use or disuse during its lifetime. For instance, he believed that giraffes, he was very obsessed with giraffes. Not really sure why. I think he just thought that they were kind of weird looking. But he believed that the original giraffes were very short-necked and that they would actually, in the process of stretching to reach for leaves on higher branches, that stretching kind of stuck, and then their offspring had longer necks, and the stretching just kept going on until we got to the modern day long neck giraffes. It's not correct. That's not how this stuff works. Obviously, if you lose a finger or an arm or something like that, your offspring are not going to be born without an arm. But it was an interesting thought. Then we get to move on to Charles Darwin and his early influences. I'm sure most of you guys have heard of Darwin before. Darwinism gets a lot of hate, especially from a lot of religious affiliations for ideas of evolution. Darwin actually did not ever come out and say that he thought humans evolved from monkeys. What everyone is referring to is a book that we will talk about in the next slide. But for now, let's talk about some of his early influences. So from Lyell and Hutton, who were two geologists, he kind of took this idea that Earth is very old and that gradualism occurs. And gradualism is that natural processes often occur slowly and gradually. And Lyell and Hutton got this by looking at different strata in the Earth and kind of recognizing that there were different fossils and that they could actually connect those to different ages of time. From Cuvier, he kind of took this idea that fossils resemble living forms. So these were not just random pieces of natural art that the Earth made, that these actually were once living beings. From Malthus, he took some ideas about reproduction, populations, and variation that occurs within them. And then from Linnaeus and Lamarck, he took the idea that species are related and that species can change. Now, Darwin was from the UK. He was born in 1809, died in 1882. Things were still religious during this period, but it wasn't like it was during Buffon's time. So he was not getting a lot of hate for proposing that things could change or creating his theories that evolution is even a mechanism. But he traveled on the HMS Beagle to actually go and study the finches on the Galapagos Islands. And Darwin was raised in a fairly affluent family. His grandfather was a naturalist, so he took a lot of influence from that. He was able to go to really, really good schools. He had a lot of high class and high powered associates. So he had a lot easier of a time kind of getting his start. And it was easier for him to kind of get renowned. Like his grandfather, he was also a naturalist, and he developed through this study of these finches, this mechanism of natural selection. He didn't call it natural selection, though. He actually called it descent with modification, and it was basically this theory that traits can be passed from parent to offspring, which we now call heredity. He also had this idea of common descent, so that one species is the ancestor of two or more species later in time. So this is really the first time that we're seeing a kind of theory for evolution that has a mechanism behind it, something that can actually prove it exists. Once he developed all of these theories, he kind of consolidated them into this book called On the Origins of Species in 1859. This is the book that everybody is referring to when they hate on Darwin, but actually On the Origin of Species only talks about animal evolution, specifically about his finches. Now, he did believe that humans evolved in a similar fashion from some kind of common ancestor that didn't necessarily look like we do today. But he didn't come out right and say that because it would have been very, very controversial at the time, and he was a little bit too afraid to be that bold. In a later book, he does mention it, but it's a fairly brief section. And the whole reason that he came up with these ideas is while he was studying these finches, he realized that there was a lot of variety of them on this island, specifically in different areas of the island and on some of the smaller islands, and that each of these different varieties of finches had different beak sizes, beak shapes, different coloring, and he realized that it was them adapting to their environment. So it made them easier to hide, it made it easier for them to eat the different nuts and other, food sources on their specific regions or islands. But they were obviously still all finches. Now, Charles Darwin was actually not the only person to come up with this idea of evolution with a mechanism behind it. There was also Alfred Russel Wallace. He also studied living organisms on islands, but he focused on the Indonesian archipelago. And he kind of independently discovered natural selection. And when he realized that his work and Darwin's was so similar, he sent a letter to Darwin in 1858, so a year before Darwin published his book. And they actually agreed to jointly present to the Linnean Society of London in July of 1858. Now, they did both go to this event, and they did both present, but they didn't end up doing it together like they had agreed upon. Obviously, Darwin went on to write On the Origin of Species the following year and was greatly praised for it, got a lot of attention, and unfortunately, Alfred Russel Wallace kind of got shoved aside, but we do know about him, and he should get the recognition. Last but not least, we have Gregor Mendel. He was an Austrian biologist and an Augustinian monk. The Augustinian monks are actually a branch of Catholicism. And Mendel is actually one of my favorites. I think he's very misunderstood. He was actually born to a very poor farming family, so he didn't have money to go to college, to get that kind of education. He didn't have those connections that Darwin did. But he joined the Augustinian monks because they actually placed a lot of value in science and learning. And so they paid for him to get his education. Now, he had a couple failed stints at being a teacher before eventually just staying at the monastery, where they had a very nice garden. And it's where he based all of his experiments on. But through his experiments, he started breeding pea plants. Now, he used true breeding pea plants, and he did this so that he could avoid having issues from other types of inheritance, and get a clearer view of dominant and recessive behavior. But through this experiment, he actually developed this law of inheritance. So this idea that genes are inherited as pairs of alleles or traits that behave in a dominant and recessive way. Before this, people mostly just thought that, you get exactly half of your DNA from your mom, half of your DNA from your dad, and it blends all willy-nilly, and there's really no way to determine what someone's going to look like or how things are going to create offspring. But this law of inheritance answered this question. Now, unfortunately, Mendel was not a great people person. His time at the monastery, he was kind of isolated. He didn't make a lot of connections within the scientific world. So he just wasn't very good at talking to people. He only really published his work in very obscure journals, so it didn't reach a wide audience. And his work was so highly statistical that a lot of people at that time just couldn't understand it. So they didn't realize that this was a revolutionary idea. And he kind of just got ignored, overlooked. It wasn't until well after his death that people read his work and were like, oh, wait, this is actually amazing. So the modern synthesis for evolutionary theory takes some from Mendel's theory of heredity and inheritance, specifically how genes can be reshuffled from each generation to the next, which is something we call variation. But it didn't really explain how variations or new genes appear and where they come from. We're also going to take some stuff from Darwin, obviously, his theory of evolution, which provides an understanding of how a variation leads to differential survival and reproduction. And this is really important to the modern synthesis because his ideas of inheritance and natural selection can actually be combined into kind of the first evolutionary synthesis. And it really helps answer questions like why do genes change in frequency? How do the total sum of genes or the gene pool vary within and across populations? And it actually led to an entirely new field called population genetics, which is still studied today. We didn't really talk about him, but we are going to take a little bit from Thomas Hunt Morgan. He actually worked with fruit flies, mostly because fruit flies reproduce very quickly, so it's very easy to study population genetics through them. But he studied their chromosomes and found that a gene could spontaneously change. This is really important. This is another mechanism of evolution, and it's actually one of the most important ones, which we call today mutation. Mutations are really important because they can lead to a new variant of a gene. For instance, eye color. If you didn't know, originally everybody actually had brown eyes and brown hair, and it was a natural gene mutation that created blue eyes, later on green eyes, blonde hair, red hair, all of that kind of stuff. Now, mutations can be beneficial, for instance, like the eye color. So when they're beneficial, they can make you stronger or better adapted within your environment, specifically for future generations. And a lot of times this will be things like reproductive fitness. Eye color is actually more of a neutral mutation, but because humans are unique in how we mate, and the fact that we have a lot more individual preference for mates, things like eye color and hair color can obviously give you a reproductive advantage. It can also be things like, which we will talk about later in the semester, like sickle cell anemia, which actually provides some, despite being a disease, it can actually provide some protection against malaria. Mutations can also be harmful. These can cause reproductive failure or biological diseases or even death. And then again, they can be neutral, where they stick around even though they aren't particularly helpful or harmful. Because they aren't harmful or helpful, they just kind of stay. There's really nothing to, breed them out. People aren't dying from them, so we aren't losing that gene in a population that dies. We're also not really gaining it in any way because it's not particularly helpful for reproductive systems. And last but not least, I have a couple key evolutionary terms for you guys. These aren't going to be on the test or quiz or anything like that, but you should still know them. So the first one is law of segregation, and this states that the particles or genes for traits appear separately in the sex cells of parents and are then reunited in an offspring. There's also the law of independent assortment, and this states that particles or genes for different traits are sorted and passed on independently of one another. Basically, that they do not blend like prior models thought they did. And then, of course, natural selection, which is that theory outlined by Charles Darwin to explain evolution, which argues that some traits are more suited to an organism's particular environmental context and therefore are passed on more often into the next generation. When this happens, these traits become more prevalent in successive generations, and over a long period of time, it can actually result in an entire evolutionary shift in populations. So it could be a very small mutation, but because it is so beneficial, populations pass it on more frequently. Eventually, it becomes the dominant trait or, gene within that population. And when it stays like that long enough, along with other smaller um, adaptations and stuff, it can actually lead to things like an entirely new species. I also have this little graph for you guys. It's really not that important. I just think it's kind of cool. And this shows the branches of life throughout time. You can see we have bacteria, we have fungi, we have fish, and then way over on that kind of right side, we have mammals. In the grand scheme of things, mammals have only been on Earth for a very small, insignificant portion of time, especially when you actually get down further. I don't know if you guys can see it, if it's too small or not, but humans and Neanderthals are over here at the very end. And it is just such a small fraction of time that it's kind of amazing. That is all I have for you for this lecture. I will upload a separate lecture for the Lab 2 portion. And let me know if you guys have any questions on the lab or anything else.